Welcome to the fastest daf in town. Today, Masechtas Zevachim daf Tes. We are going to begin on Tes Amud Aleph, about 8 lines from the top Maskif. So we're going to be asking a question in a second, but before we need to remind ourselves of what we saw in yesterday's daf. That when it comes to a carbon Pesach, the din is as follows. Very interesting, unique concept. That when it comes to the proper time, which is Erev Pesach, after Chatzos. So if it was done Lishma for the sake of a carbon Pesach, obviously it's kosher, that's what you're supposed to do. If you would not have the right intentions on Pesach, namely you think it's an Ola, so meaning on Erev Pesach, then it's possible. But what's interesting is if it's during the other times of the year. As I mentioned, I said, for example, November, right? Some random date in which it's clearly not Pesach or Erev Pesach, and you have the intention for it to be a carbon Pesach, so the din is that it will, let's just read the words. Shar Moshe Shana Lishmo, if you say this is going to be for carbon Pesach and it's in November, it will not work. But the unbelievable thing is Shlo Lishma, if you actually have the wrong intentions, namely you have the carbon Pesach, not on Pesach, but you say, I want this carbon to be an Ola. All of a sudden, it transforms into becoming a Shlomim. So the Gemara was asking, so, okay, that's an interesting concept, but why do we say it becomes an Ola, maybe a Shlomim? Maybe it should actually be it should be an Ola. In other words, whatever your thought process is in November regarding this carbon Pesach, let it be that new thing. Why is it that no matter what your other thought process is, that it's going to be kosher, unless your thought process, again, was a carbon Pesach, but any other carbon, it will automatically be a shlomim. So Gemara gave a couple of answers. One of them is that a shlomim, like a carbon Pesach, they're similar because they're both eaten, not just by Kohanim, but anyone. But the second thing we mentioned is that another similarity between a shlomim and a carbon Pesach is they're both kedushim kalim. And therefore it makes sense that we should say a Pesach is transformed into a shlomim and not to, for example, an Ola, a Chatas, an Asham, which are kedushim, kachi kedushim. So Gemara says, well, 1 second. The problem is, and I alluded to this in yesterday's daf, that's not the only other example of a carbon which is kedushim kalim. So that's what Gemara asks. So Mask Rabbi Yitzchak Barebi Sabra Amy, when we say Shachto Shem Meiser Lahavi Meiser. So again, I can understand if you have the intention to be an oila, that okay, we don't want that to happen. That can't be because you can't elevate it through your machshava from Kedushim Kalim to a higher sanctity of Kodesh Kedushim. Okay, that I get. But maybe if you have the machshava for it to be Meiser Behema, which is also similar to Shlomim, that it's Kodshim Kalim, it's a lower level, if you will, of Kedusha, that we should say it doesn't become a Shlomim, it should just have the same sanctity as Meiser Behema. So what difference does that make? You have to bring it anyway, L'mai Hilchasa, Deloy Liboy Nesachim, because you would not have to bring the Sachim, because a Shlomim requires Nesachim, as Rashi says, the Hakadoshim Kalmhu, Bechor Meiser Intun in Nesachim. Only, and that's the reason why on some level Shlomim has a higher Kedusha, which is actually, you could actually think it makes sense it shouldn't be a Shlomim, because Shlomim is, as we saw before a few dafim ago, is actually a higher level of Kedusha, if you will, if you can say those words, than Meiser or Bechor, because there's no Nesachim, but a Shlomim does. So that is something which is again questionable. Why don't we say that if you have the machshava for Meiser Behema, should have the status of Meiser Behema, and also in addition to that, there's a second nafkamina would be Lemilka Leha B'lo Yigael, that there would be a din of getting malchus based on the law of Lo Yigael. Rashi says, because by Meiser Behema it says the words Yeh Kadesh Lo Yigael. We learn out in Masechtas Becharis that the Lo Yigael regarding Meiser Behema, when it says that Lo Yimacherhu, that it's not to be sold. So again, you could violate that law which is unique to Ma'aser Behema. So Amar Kra, no, we can't say that in November, if you take a Karban Pesach and have a machshava for it to be Ma'aser Behema, that it should have the status of Ma'aser Behema, because Hasiri Yekodesh Zem Ma'aser Ve'in Acher Ma'aser. The pasuk says regarding Ma'aser Behema, V'vartikol Peter Rechem Hashem v'chol v'chol Ma'aser Bakar B'tzayin Kol Asher Yaver Tachas Hashavet Hasiri Yekodesh Hashem. So the way the Ma'aser Behema works is that the animals are put through a narrow path, and the 10th animal you hit it, if you will, with some type of dye that's on it, so that it's identifiable even after there's hundreds in the other side which one is Ma'aser Behema. But it's only that way that it becomes a Ma'aser Behema, not in any other way. So therefore, in this situation, would not become Ma'aser Behema. Okay, so Ema Shachtel Hashem Bechor will have a Bechor. So Bechor is also Kedashim Kalam. So why don't we say it should have the status of Bechor, not Shlom? So what difference it makes? Duli Boy Nesachim, as we said before, similar to Ma'aser Behema, Bechor does not need Nesachim. Inami Dilias Kahanim. Also, when it comes to the din of Bechor, it is given over to the Kohanim. So why? Maybe that's what you have to do. So Bechor Nami Avara Ma'aser Gomer is a Gzer Shava. So therefore, and that's we find this Gzer Shava to link Ma'aser Behema and Bechor in many dinim, including this. Okay, so Ve'ema Shachtel Hashem Tumura. Let's say if a person has intention on November, regarding this Karban Pesach, that this should be a Tumura, Lohavi Tumura. It should have the status of Tumura. So my Hilchasa, L'milka Leha, that a person would get Malchus because of the Pasuk Lo Yachlifanu, Inami L'meikabel Hebel Yimach Hebel Yigail, or because it also falls under these categories of Lo Yimach Hebel Yigail. So Omer Marzutra Beruda Ranachman Omer Kra, on this the Pasuk says, Lo yivakar bein toivel rav, lo yimerenu. You're not supposed to do a tamura. V'im hamer yimerenu, but if you do, v'hayahu utumurasu yeh kodesh. It becomes kodesh. Not only the animal retains its kedusha, even though it'll also transfer that kedusha over, but they're both kodesh. And then it says liyigai, you can't sell it. So that's what the pasuk says. So zu tamura v'ein acher tamura. That's the only way it can be done. So therefore, again, in this situation, there's no other option. We got to find a kedashim kalim in which we don't have exersa kosef to say that it cannot work in this particular, which is only shlamim. Well, maybe not. We can find another. The ema shachtel l'shem taida. So taida is also kedashim kalim. So lahavi ki taida my hilchasa l'ti'idu lechem. So we know that toda, a Karban toda, is unique in that it needs to be accompanied together with 40 breads, some matzah, some chametz. So maybe that needs to be done in this case. Now, mi'ikamidi, the Pesach gufa will boy lechem. When it comes to the Pesach itself, it doesn't need lechem. So umaisro boy lechem, and all of a sudden, now that you did it this way, now it's going to require lechem. It doesn't make any sense. So look in Rashi. Maybe not. So anyway, the point is that a Pesach doesn't require lechem. So all of a sudden now you're transferred over, it's going to need lechem. It's like, doesn't make sense. Why would you think that would be a requirement if the initial Karban Pesach is not something which requires lechem? So why would you think that would be the case? So Yehachi Hashinami, mi'ikimida the Pesach gufa loy by nesachim, umbaisur by nesachim. You can ask the same question because we know Karban Pesach doesn't have nesachim libations that accompany it. You just bring the Karban Pesach. But when it comes to Shlomim, you do need it. So you can ask the same kasha. So how could it transfer to a Karban Shlomim? Obviously, we're going to say it transfers to something, but that shouldn't be a reason to exclude Taida because of its lechem. So then why would you could say the same kasha by the Shlom, which is unique that you have to bring the Sachem? So Anan Hachikarim, that's what I meant to say. Mi ikamidi. The Meiser Taida Atzma loy boy lechem. The Meiser Taida Atzma doesn't need. The Ilu Meiser the Isa lahavim alma boy lechem. But in this case, when the Karban Pesach wouldn't need lechem, now let's look at this Rashi. Kagain hifresh taidasai. let's say you were mafresh a carbon taida, and then v'avda, it got lost. V'hifresh acheres. So now you separated a second animal. V'nimsas arishayin, you found the original one. So in hashniya te'una lechem. The second animal, you still have to bring it as a carbon. However, you don't bring lechem with it. Now, if in this case it really was a taida, it just got lost, now you found it, it doesn't need lechem. So this case, which was really a carbon pesach, it was just not Pesach time, and you had it l'shem taida, of course you're not going to need lechem. So that's the logic behind that. Okay, so therefore, basically, we went through all the different types of karbanos of Kedushim Kalim, and none of them could possibly be it, so it's got to be shlomim, like almost by process of elimination. So, Maskevla Mar Yema Bered Rav Hillel Mamaid Meiser Pesach Siv. How do we know we're talking about Meiser Pesach? Dilma b'Meiser Asham Ksiv. Maybe we're talking about the leftovers of an asham. Okay, let's go slow. Says Rashi, v'im min hatzayin. When it says from a sheep, the asham nami ayil tamim min hatzayin hu. How do we know necessarily when we say these words that we're talking about Pesach, which of course is a tzayin, right? You either bring a tzayin or an ez, but a sheep or a goat for a carbon Pesach. But an asham also you can bring a tzayin. The enu bum in a bucker, because it doesn't come from cattle. So, because we're saying, what the pasuk says that if it's tzayin or bucker, well, it can't be bucker because bucker is not for carbon pesach. So it's talking about that in the meiser pesach is shlomim. But how do you know that's even talking about pesach? Maybe it's talking about meiser asham is for a shlomim, right? So Omer Rava Omer Kra, the pasuk says, V'im min hatzayin karbanoi l'zevach shlomim. So the pasuk, and we'll see it in entirely. V'im min hatzayin karbanoi l'zevach shlomim. When if you bring from for shlomim a sheep, zachar nekeva tamim yakrivenu. So it could be a male sheep or a female sheep when it comes to a shlomim, and it obviously has to be tamim. It can't have any blemishes. So what do we see from this pasuk? So we learn out davar hishva b'chol hatzayin. Something in which is equal for all of the sheep. So what does that mean? A Pesach can be a lamb or a goat, not an asham, as an asham is not brought from Izim, right? So when it's saying this, therefore, it's telling us that a shlomim is, let's get the words again, it's karbano l'zevach shlomim davar hishva b'chol tzayin, and therefore again a Pesach is a tzayin, and the shlomim can be a tzayin. So a Pesach can be an asham, can be a lamb or a goat, not an asham. Not as asham is not brought from Izim. Okay, so what's the problem with that? So it's got to be something in which is something which is also being brought from a with Izim. So let's see. Okay, that's the answer basically. So Maskav Rav Avin Barchia v'item, some say it was Rav Avin Bar Kahana b'chol ater at amrit min lahoitzi v'kan min l'rabois. So normally, when we have the word min in a pasuk, that's an exclusionary word. But over here, we're using it to include. So back in the Rashi, b'chol makom ata omer min l'hoitzihu. Whenever you have the word min, it's an exclusion. Going, for example, min habehema. So you can bring certain karbanos, but min habehema, which is l'hoitzi, it comes to exclude reiva v'nirva if they were cohabited with. Umin habakar l'hoitzi as a neva, umin atzayin l'hoitzi as a muksa. As Gemara Baba Kalma says, that there are certain things that cannot be brought as karbanos. Things that were designated for Avodah Zarah and the like, or were used for Avodah Zarah. But the key point that Rashi is pointing out is that typically when you find the word min, that's coming to exclude. But over here, it seems to be it's including. The Ka'amrit back in Rashi, min hatzoyin pesach mashma sheba mikoil tzoyin. It comes from all sheep. In other words, the drasha is that since it says min hatsoin, right? So that's coming to include a carbon in which can also be a goat, right? Which is not an asham, which can't be a goat. So the question is, okay, but how do we, in this one context, find that the word min is including, it should be excluding like normal? So Rav Mani hacha nami min l'hoitzi. Actually, it's excluding over here as well. Deloi asi ben shtei shanim, that it cannot, a carbon pesach cannot be 2 years old. V'asim in a keva, and it can't be a female animal, says Rashi. Min l'hoitzihu deloi ben shtei shanim v'loi asi in a keva. Umiyu hatsoin, the fact that it just says the word hatsoin, mikol min soin mashma, any type of tsoin, and the word son is ben kfasim ben izim. The word son, that word actually means not just sheep, but it also includes goats. That's because kfasim are sheep or lamb, and an iz is a goat. So tsoin is more of a generic word which is inclusive of sheep and goats, and therefore, but it's true. The word min actually is a miyut. It is coming to exclude. It's coming to exclude a carbon pesach cannot be 2 years old, and it has to be a zach, or cannot be in a keva. Okay, Maskav Rachama Bagta. So from Baghdad, Mi Masasamid Hachi. Can you actually say Mi Masasamid? Can you say the Chik Siv Hai B'Moiser Pesach Siv, that this is talking about again the carbon pesach? V'Homenach Siv, but the pasuk says Im Kesevhu Makriv. If you're Makriv a Kesev as carbon of Hikarbos Lefnei Hashem. So this is the pasuk. So it says Im Kesev, and then it says Im A's, if you bring a goat, right, which is a different location, Perikid Gimel, Mechlal Delal B'Meiser Pesach Siv. So the fact that it says these things, it must be, it's not talking about a carbon Pesach. So look at Rashi. Ela b'shlomim greda. It's talking about a regular case of a shlomim. V'hachikarmer. This is how you read this. Im neder will habi menatzayin. If you made a neder that I'm going to bring tzon, I'm going to bring a carbon as a neder. I'm bringing tzayin. So yavi ez a shirtze. O kesev o ez. Because you use this generic word tzayin, it means you could bring either one. The ibo moiser pesach siv. We're talking about carbon pesach. Lumli im kesav im ez. Why does it have to say that? Pshita nemikvasim izim huba. Right? The habagufa ksiv uminakvasim in izim. We already know as we read in Parshas Bo, in Shabbos HaChodesh, that it says clearly that that's what is brought for a carbon pesach, either one. So the fact that it stipulates it again in Sefer Vayikra seems to show that it's not talking about a pesach; it's talking about something else. Where it says Hahuma boil l'sanya. The reason why it's over here is not to say it's not talking about Moisher Pesach, but it's talking about something else. No, it is talking about a Pesach. So then why does it need to have these words? Not to tell us that these are the things that are brought for carbon Pesach, because we know that. But rather, Hahuma boil l'sanya. Keves or Rabbi says a Pesach la'alya. It's referring that even the tail is also brought as well on the Mizbeach. Kisha'imer im. So when it says the word im kesev l'rabos pesach she'aver shenasa, that's coming to include a carbon pesach, even though the year has passed. Now again, normally the carbon pesach cannot be brought afterwards. However, in this situation, if you have a pesach she'aver shenasa, it will take upon itself the status not as a pesach anymore, but it will still take upon the status of a shlomim. V'shlomim haboy machmas pesach l'chol mitzvos shlomim shiru smich and sakim tenuf l'chaz v'shaik. And when it comes to, as we mentioned, a carbon pesach, you have a pesach which is brought as a shlomim, right, with a machshava or whatever, not during that time of the year of Pesach time. So then it takes upon itself all the laws of a shlomim that requires smicha, nesachim, tenufas chaz v'shaik, and the waving of these sacrificial parts. Kishomer im ez, when it says the word ez, hifseka inyan, that breaks it up. Limad al ha'ez she'enu tu'una alya. They're telling you that the ez does not require that the tail is brought up on the mizbech. Only the lamb. not the A's, not the goat. Okay, let's look at Rashi. Well, Aliyah, Shedehei Kariva im emurim keneged hakalya solmata. That when it comes davka to the sheep, that animal needs to not only be its sacrificial parts are brought up, but also its tail. Dechsid, the pasuk says, Lu'umas ha'etza, referring to the etza as the backbone. Yasirena should be removed makam shakolis ya'itzais, with a place because of the kidneys that literally they give advice. That's what it means. Shlomim boyim machmas pesach chagigas shlomim haboyim machmas pesach arba aser fine. Abahama hachanafka midavu deshmul nafka diemar avua deshmul v'imin sayin karbono zevach shalomim. So davar haba min hatzayin yehel zevach shalomim. We said that where do you learn this din that it's sayin which is a carbon pesach with at different times it becomes a shalomim. So v'akati Rav Nachman Rabu nafka diemar. Furthermore, we learn from him. And seemingly a third place, another pasuk. The Rav Nachman Amarabba Barabu Amadain Lamoiser Pesach Shekar Shlomim. Hanu the Pesach becomes a Shlomim Shenemar Zavata Pesach Hashem Kechat Sainu Bakar. It says, oh, the Karm Pesach bring his bakar, bring cattle. What do you mean? In Pesach ba Elman Kavasim Omen Izim. It could either be sheep or goat, not bakar. The fact that it mentions bakar, it's coming to tell you that sometimes the Moisher Pesach, but again in our situation as well, it takes upon the status of Shlom. Okay, so questions. So then, why do we need 3 psukim? There's actually, you're right. There's 3 psukim, but we need all 3 to teach us that the Pesach turns into a Shlomim. First of all, Chad Ivri Zmanoi, the Ivri Shanasoi. One is, as Rashi says, it passed the Zman Shchitas HaPesach, so it's not the 14th of Nisan, the Ivri Shanasoi, and also it's no longer a year old. Nonetheless, it could still be brought as a Shlom. Because again, within the first year animal, only that can be brought as a carbon pesach. An animal that's already past its year cannot be brought as a carbon pesach anymore. So that's one pasuk. The chad le'ivrizman. The one is also to say that the time has passed. It's not the 14th of Nisan. V'loi shenasai, but its year has not gone by yet. Says Rashi, v'im shachtu koydem pesach. Let's say you shechted before the 14th. L'shem shlomim. So kasher Rav Chazil Pesach Rishon. So you actually could have, let's say you shechted in Adar, and it's obvious, and it's less than a year old. So you could have waited another month, and you would have been able to brought it as a carbon Pesach. Could have been perfectly fine. But instead, you brought it before, in let's say February. The din is that it's considered still as a shlomim. M'chad l'loi ibra l'loi zmanai v'loi shenasai. Even though the year has not passed, so again it's less than a year old. However, it was also lo ivra lo zmanai, that the time has not passed by. I read the last one. I explained the last one. So it's a possibility where all 3 situations it still fit as a carbon shlomim. Either it was brought, it's already a year has gone by. Again, and the time has passed, right? It's already over a year old, and we're in the summer, right? It's a shlom. The second case is it's past its time. We're in let's say the middle of April, right? But maybe you can Pesach Sheni is coming up, right? So maybe it could be brought there. No, and the other one is let's say a year hasn't gone by, and it was shechted l'shem shlomim in again February, and those are the 3 cases. So tzrich, we need all those 3. In the time where the animal is now older, vizmano, and it's not the 14th, the idchim pesach legamri. So it's no longer shaykh to be a carbon pesach for 2 reasons. First of all, Pesach's over. You shechted it after Pesach, and it's over a year old. So obviously it's not a carbon Pesach. We'll call that a shlom. But Ivr Zmanoi, let's say it's less than a year old, Zmano, rather you shecht it again in the summer, but v'loishan also, but the year hasn't, it's still less than a year old. The chazlo Pesach Sheni emalo. So again, use the case of you shechted it a week after Pesach. So in that situation, it's still a year old, and you could have Pesach passed by, but you could still use it for Pesach Sheni. So maybe it's Pesach is not a shlomim. Because of Rachmana Hanitarti Mishum the Idchilhu Mimulsayu. The original purpose was for it to be brought on Pesach Rishon, and Pesach Rishon is gone. You would think maybe the situation where you shecht it in February, right, and it's less than a year old, and you could have still used it for Pesach Rishon, that it's not a shlomim, that's the chiddush. Okay. Look at question 1. My Isra Gimel Kroy Pesach Shaloi Bizmanu Shikar Shlomim. The Chad lo over Shnasa Bizmanu. Chad lo over Zmanu v'lo Shnasai. The Chad lo over lo Zmanu v'lo Shnasai. I don't need to explain that anymore because we just did it. Okay. Fine. So that's why we have these 3 psukim. Omer Rav Mishmei Dima Voig. So who's that? Rashi says that's Hashem of a Chacham. Maybe it's not the most common name, but that's the name of Chacham. So what does he say? Chatas sheshachtu l'shum chatas nachshain. What if you have a carbon chatas and you shechted it for nachshain? Who's nachshain? Nachshain ben Aminadav. Says Rashi, Sawyer chatas the chanukas hanesim. So nachshain was one of the nesim, as stipulated in the Parshas Naso, that all the Shvatim brought karbanos from the Chanukas HaMizbeach. So you have a chatas, and you shechted it also for chatas, but a totally different chatas, which was never even exist, don't do anymore, right? So he actually says that's kshera, unbelievable. He says it's fine. V'lo havishini kaidus, says Rashi. Do I'm reading chatas nachshain. Kivan duladarin asi, since it's as a gift, v'lo kapara al chet, and it's not a kapara in a sin, right? Because the Siyam there brought this chatas not because they sinned; it was part of the inauguration of the mizbeach. Harihi k'shchitas l'shem oila. So it has the status of something like totally disconnected. As we said, a chatas for another chatas is problematic. But a chatas for an oila, right, we said it's kosher because it's totally disremoved from it. The koshkein deshini balo moihavi doi shachta u'eschaper ba'nachshain. Obviously, in this situation, your intention was not for nachshain, right? So we're not talking about an issue of shinoi balam. Okay. So anyway, we say that it is kosher. Diarmer Kraz, the pasuk says Zois Taras Achatos, in which let's get these words. V'samach es yadai Zois Taras Achatos. Dabra al Aaron v'elbana v'leimor Zois Taras Achatos b'mchoim asher tishachat oil tishachat achatos. The same place you should shecht it. Kodesh Kedoshim he. It has the highest level of kedusha. So Torah achas ochol hachatois. The fact that it says this is telling you that all the laws of the chatois have the same din. Okay. So Yosef Rava b'karmula l'hashmaisa esvei Rav Mishar shel Rava Rav Shimon Aimer kol hamanachos, any flower offering shin nikmatzu shlo l'shmon, and you did the kamitza, the scooping of the flour of the mincha without the right intention, ksheris. In that situation, we say it is also kosher. It actually works, and you don't have to do anything else. So Rashi says, Rav Shimon Paul Gamanachos Zevachim. When it comes to Zevachim, he doesn't disagree. He agrees that it's not Ol Hashem Chayiva. When it comes to a mincha, it does work. Why? You can't compare the two. Let's say a person does the kemitza, which was supposed to be for in a al machvas, right? We say on Shabbos, right? So it's a flat pan. L'shem bim marcheshes in it, right? Marcheshes is a deeper pan. So Maseha Moichichan Aleha Shi Machvas. It's clear that it really is a machvas, or Charivo L'Shem Belula. Let's say you have a mincha which is like a dry mincha, and you had in mind for a one which is mixed up with oils. Maaseh Moichichan Shi Chariva. It's clear that it's dry, right? So Rav Shimon holds that since there's no oil in it, so it is chariva, right? It's considered like a dry one without oil. So your thoughts for it to be bulula is nothing, right? Because what do you mean your thoughts are that this dry mincha is an oiled, mixed up one? You can see clearly it's not, right? So you can't make a distinction. You can see clear distinctions when it comes to a mincha, which one's which, or which one was prepared in a deep frying pan, or one which was on like a skillet, like a very thin one. So it's kosher by mincha, but by Zevachim, a carbon, there's no difference between one carbon and the next. You see one carbon, you see the other carbon. You don't know which, unless of course you know it's a zachar and a keva. These dinim, but it's an oila. Obviously, if it's in the cave, you know it's not an oila, right? But nonetheless, the animals themselves, you look at it, you wouldn't be able to know the difference, right? So therefore, that's the reason why it's not oila shem chayva when it comes to Zevachim. Mashenkin, he says by menachos it works. Zevachim enukin shchita achas kulon, kabbalah achas kulon, zrika achas kulon. They're all the same. All the actions are basically the same. Says Rashi, chariva is minchas chayte she'en bo shemen. There's no oil in a minchas chayte. Dechsiv v'lo yosamol hashemen. So Maseh Tochichan Moichichan, Rashi says, the machshava hanikeres she sheker. Your thoughts obviously are wrong because you see there's oil in it, right? So that's the reason why it's kosher and it's oil shem chayva. But now when it comes to shchita, says Rashi, v'chi shachet oila l'shem chatas leka hakera de meshaker. It's not clear that your thought process is wrong. Maybe it's true. It's a chatas, it's an oil, so your machshav is that it's an oil instead of a chatas or something. So it's not so clear. That's the reason why it's not oil. It's not oil l'shem chayva. Again, maybe I shouldn't have used the example of a chatas, but another carbon which would be kosher but not oil l'shem chayva. So that's the distinction. So taima de maseh moichichan. The only reason why he would say it's kosher and we say that it's oil l'shem chayv, oil l'shem baal, is only because it's clear by the mincha what's what. Ha'ein maseh moichichan loy. However, you can't tell the difference, like by these karbanos, then we would not say. So why does he make that distinction? Lame wants to say zois taras hamincha, zois tara achas l'chol menachos. The pasuk, apparently, you should be able to say all the dinim are the same, even if you can't tell the difference between one and the other. But yet, for some reason, we make that drasha, as we just did, when it comes to a chatas, which is shechted l'shem chatas nachshain, right? So he said, it works because all the dinim apply by all the chatas. What do you mean? If that's a good drasha, you can say the same thing here. He obviously doesn't. Eliyim or Hachimar. Omer Mishmei Dima Boig. So he said in his name, the Chatas Sheshachto Almanas She is Schaper Bo Nachshen Kshera. Ein Kaparu Lamesim. It's talking about an issue of Shinui Bailim. That your Machshava is, okay, I want Nachshen to receive Kapara in this case. So in that situation, in that case it's kosher, because this person, Nachshen, was in the time, he was in the Midbar, right? In the time of the Mishkan. So he's not alive anymore. So obviously, that's not going to work, right? Hilkach says, Rashi, L'krin be ha'b'mechuyev kapara k'moisoi. So in that situation, we don't say it's an issue of Shinui Baalim, because in this situation, the Baal is not alive, right? So because of that, that's the reason why it is kosher. Okay, let's slow down and look at question. Let's keep going. So Volema Meis Ba'alma. Maybe it's Volema Meis Ba'alma. So maybe we're just talking about some stam person who died. Hakamashmo, the time of the mace, the reason is the guy's dead. Hachai, if he would be alive, do with the nachshain psula. But if he would be alive, similar to nachshain, even though it's a totally different chatas, he would be psula. Umayniu chatas nozer v'chatas mitzayra. So again, when it comes to chatas nozer and chatas mitzayra, which are not for sins, similar to the meluyim, that chatas was not for a sin. A person brings a chatas nozer, could be questionable, but certainly chatas mitzayra was not for a sin. So therefore, it's coming to tell you that that it would be possible if you had the wrong machshava from one chatas to the other, chatas chelim, for example, the chatas nazir, chatas matzayra. Okay, so hani oilus ninhu. What do you mean? If there's no sin, so it should have the same status like an oila. So let's go look at Rashi first. Dumid nachshain shemechuyev chatas she'enu al chet. Hadoimel l'sir nachshin k'goin chatas nozim mitzayra habois l'hachshir psula. So he said, Hani oyos ninhu. Yanan kimlon, we learned, chatas sheshachta al mishim mechuyev oil kshera. So he said that, okay, obviously it's not an oil. What do you mean? It's not an oil. It's a chatas, right? The pasuk says they're chatas mitzayra, chatas nozer. But it really is similar to an oil in that it's really not the same thing as a typical chatas, that its purpose is to achieve kapara, its purpose is lahachshir, to allow the mitzayra to be able to go to shalosh machanai, so what all the different dinim, and the mitzayra to be able to drink wine. So it's lahachshir, to be able to eat kachim, but it has nothing to do with what the chatas is. So therefore, we should say it has really the same din that if you have a chatas and your machshavas for an oil, that's kosher. So we normally say it should be kosher by that. If you have a machshava by a chatas, for it to be a chatas nazir matzar, that it should be kosher, which we don't say. So il yimar hachimar. Omramish may boy, this poor guy, right? He doesn't get a whole lot of attention in Shas, and we keep coming up with different interpretations of what he means. But maybe that we have to be very careful and make sure that we're quoting him beautifully. Chatas sheshachta al shemechuyev chatas. So let's say if someone has a chatas, but you have the intention on someone else who is alive, and he's mechuyev chatas kenachshain, just like nachshain. Not that nachshain is alive, but even though it's a chatas in which is not like a regular chatas, it's kshera. That is kosher. Chatas nachshain oilahi, because it's like an oila. So basically, you're saying you're right. Maybe the din is take that it will be kosher. It will have these karbanos in which do not have the same purpose as a typical chatas chaylev. That maybe the din take is that it would be kosher if you have a machshava for carbon chatas, for it to be a chatas mitzayra or nazir, or which is similar to nachshin. So ikadi aimer ra mishmei dimagoig. Actually, there's a different lashon that maybe if you have a carbon chatas and you're thinking nachshain is possible, chatas nachshain oilhi. So a chatas nachshain is a different carbon. So therefore, it's considered like shine kodesh. So lema chatas nazir chatas matzayra. So once you use those examples, that would also be a shinoi. Kodesh. So ikar chatois nakat. The first one ever brought is the one that we wanted to mention. So obviously, which one was brought first was nachshain. Okay, so going back and forth over there. So let's flesh this out. You can again understand it's as well as we just went through it. You have to memorize 30 blood and Gemara. It's not so simple to know what the correct answer is if they would ask you a question, in which they did. Question TA 19. Chatas sheshachta al manas shechaper nachshain kshera. So it says, let's say it's kosher. So madua, why should it taka be kosher? So they want two answers to this. So either because shein kapara l'mesim, right? Because there's no kapara for mesim, and therefore there's no shinui balam over here. Or mishum shechatas nachshain ka'oila, and therefore it's like your shecht al mishum chuyav oila, as we said in that situation. If you have a chatas and you shecht it al manas shishtachu oila, so then it's kosher. Okay. So those are the two answers, and I believe this is the same question as TB. TB 21. So let's see what I wrote. Zelo b'shvil achatas el ka'oila b'nesim, right? It has the same, okay. Zeloi carbon yachid, it's not because of that. Ein chatas sibor b'misa, it's not because of chatas sibor, which is true. We did learn already that, but it's the notion that Nachshon is not alive, and ein kapara l'mesim. Okay, ein kapara l'mesim. It's not because of its carbon sibor, right? Because we're not talking about a carbon sibor, right? And this is Chanukas and Hanesim was brought by Nachshon, so obviously that was not a correct answer, but maybe I was in the right ballpark. Omarav, chatas chaylev sheshachtu l'shem chatas dam. Let's say you have the right carbon in mind, but the problem is for a different avera. You have one carbon which was supposed to be brought because you ate non-kosher fats, but your intention was for the sin of blood, or l'shem chatas avodas kachavim. Your intention was for avodah zarah. So we say kshera. In this situation, unbelievable. It actually says it's kosher. Let's go in Rashi. Rabusa nakat, telling us a huge chiddush. Afgal adam l'shar chatois, even though it's not really comparable. Shem b'kiso seira, v'hi enu kshera b'kiso el b'sa'ira. Right? That when it comes to carbon for avodah zarah, you can't bring either a kisa or a seira. It has to be a seira or sa'ir, right? A part of sa'ir. Anyway, the point is that a kisa is not allowed. So nonetheless, you would think it's a totally separate thing, and therefore the chiddush still is that if you had such thing in mind, it works. However, if you have, because they were all sins. However, if you have the intention, even though it's a chatas to a chatas, but it is a nazir l'shem chatas matzar, it's psula, because it's considered to be shinui kodesh. So hani oilus ninhu. These have the status of oilus, and therefore it doesn't work. So it's a little confusing because I thought we said that when it comes to machshava of a chatas to an oila, that it does work. But here it's actually a chatas and a chatas, but he holds that it's an oil, and it has it's similar to an oila, and therefore it has the din of shini kodesh. Okay. Boy Rabba chatas chayil sheshachtu l'shem chatas the tumas mikdash kedasha of mahu. Now this is a little bit different because you both did sins. So then, therefore, they both have an Isser Kares. Me, I'm reading Kares Kamaisa, that they're both similar in that regard. They're mostly of Kares. Ein Kavua Kamaisa. It doesn't have the same status because, as we know, Tumas Mikdash or Kedaishav has a din of you can bring an Olav Yared depending on your financial status. You can bring an animal, a bird, right? So maybe they're not the same, and that has the same status as a totally different thought process, like a chatas matzor and a chatas nazir, that is considered to be shinui kodesh. So Rav Acha Rabba Masti Kuhul Psula. So one way of looking at this possible, my time b'shachan osal chatas l'shem oisa chatas. It has to be for that chatas. Therefore, all these are possible. Amli Rav Ashi Rav Acha Berei de Rava Boy de Rava Hechi Masnisula. So he said this question. Let's look in Rashi. So again, Rashi says, "Mi am reading Kares Kamoisa the Havale Mechuyev Kapara Kamoiso the Karin Be Olav Lo Al Chavera Be Chavera Dilma Didei Ol Dilma Ein Kavu Kamoiso Shababa Oil Yared." Okay, fine. So that's what we're saying. So again, it's totally on together. The other case was for someone else. Okay, so Odilma Ein Kavu Kamoisa. So again, he says it's possible because there's a sheikhet oisa. Okay. Amar Rav Ashu Rav Acha Boy de Rava, right? So this question of Rava, Hechi Mas Nisu law. How do you learn this? Amar Lei Anan b'shinui Baalam Mas Nisan law. He considered this an issue of shinui Baalam, right? That it's not an issue of it could be the same carbon, but it's a different person. The Hachamas Nisan law. Right? So they're two separate carbon, two different sins, but different people, right? So it's the issue of Shini Baalam was the question. Chatas Dam, the Chatas of the Chava Psula. In that case, he would hold it's because of the Shinoi Baalim, So then, if it's the same, that's when it's possible, because that's what we said. By the case of Shinoi Baalim, that's what we said. Now, in the case of Shinoi Baalim, if it's a chatas to a chatas, that's when it's possible. But a chatas to an oila and Shinoi Baalim, then when it's kosher. So therefore, in this case, he holds that it's an issue of Shinoi Baalim, but they're linked, that they're both chatais, and therefore that's why it's possible. Okay, it's not comparable to a chatas to an oila for someone, or with Shinoi Baalim that would be kosher. So al mi shemuchliv chatas nazer v'chatas matzarik sheira. However, if it would be a totally different type, or it would be a different person, Shinoi Baalim, but it's a totally different type of carbon, even though it's a chatas to a chatas, so then it would be kosher. This is the way of questioning it. The boy Rava chatas sheshachta al mi shemuchliv chatas the tumas mitas kadashamahu miamrin karis kamaisa or dama in kavua kamaisa teku. So it kind of like flips it on its head. So now, when it comes to tumas mitas kadashav, if it's the same, right, as a chatas, then when it comes to Shinoi Baalim, then it will be possible. However, if we say, well, there's a din of oil yarid, so therefore now by Shinoi Baalim it's comparable to a chatas to an oila, in which is kosher. Then on that we say teku. Okay, we're going to stop there. I hope you got it. Question 2. Boy Rabba chatas chelev sheshachta al mi shemuchliv chet al mi. So this is al mi shemuch. So it's a Shinoi Baalim question. Okay. The Tumas Mikdash. So mehem study haboya prat. I don't know what that means. Explain it maybe. So basically, again, so because of the issue of Shinoi Baalim, let's see what he writes. Mi I'm reading Kivan de Karis Kamaisa, so they're the same, and therefore they're the same by Shinoi Baalim, so therefore it's Mechuyev Kapar Kamaisa of Nifsu b'Shinoi Baalim. Although Kivan de in Kavua Kamaisa, they're not the same because of Oil Yarid, so therefore not comparable to each other. It's similar to like an oil, and therefore a chatas. It's a chatas, and you have the machshav of Shinoi Baalim for an oil. In that case, will be kosher. Maybe the same thing when it comes to tumas mitzvah kedashav. What's the answer? Teku. Adkam.